I remember an old agent of mine. She said to me, she said, Mtume, the things that you're interested in, Hollywood does not produce. I did not get into filmmaking thinking I would be able to compromise with Hollywood ever. I made a miscalculation, is in what Abel Ferrara, you just told me about, realized. The independent world that he existed in does not exist anymore. The way the independent film industry works now is it is essentially an unofficial minor leagues for Hollywood. To get into film, you have to go through these various kind of gateways. You have these film schools. Most of them are private colleges where you spend an absorbent amount of money. Then you have the film festival system. Their attitude has changed. 8 years ago, I went to a film festival and Adam Egoyan was one of the judges. He had said he's on a lot of juries these days. And recently, he was asked to jury one of the kind of newer filmmaker kind of categories. And he said he watched 5 films. He says they were technically excellent, very expensive. They looked great. But he says all 5 of them were dull. And he asked the people, he said, look, can you find me another film?
I think like it's so fascinating that I have no formal introduction to your actual filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I only know you through like your appearances on various podcasts that I've heard you on, particularly on Black Power Media with
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jared Ball. I wanted to give you a cold opportunity to just introduce yourself and like
Mm-hmm.
what you basically do. I know that you're a film professor. I know you're a
Mm-hmm.
critic. You're a filmmaker as well. So
Mm-hmm.
how would you introduce yourself?
Well, first I'll just say my name is Mtume Gant. I how I would introduce myself these days. I say I'm a filmmaker first, but then I would always then couple it with politics. I'm a Marxist who kind of goes into various strands of Marxism from people, everyone from Fanon to Walter Rodney to different types of theorists. So that colors my filmmaking, and my approach to filmmaking and my approach to film criticism. But I see, I don't call myself a film critic because I do live in the, or I do come from the tradition that a filmmaker would have to have criticism of film and thoughts around film. I don't really jive with this current. I don't know if it's as current now, but there was definitely a current when I was coming up in the aughts that filmmakers didn't have to have critical theories around, or artists in general didn't have to have critical theory around the art that they made and was a part of. And even to some degree, this is very fashioned by, I think, people like, there was a couple of filmmakers who were like they wouldn't publicly criticize other filmmakers and things like that. You know, Paul Thomas Anderson does that a lot. He does this thing where he, oh well, we should all be free to do something. And then I had a friend who, he doesn't really know him very well, but he's been around him. He says he talks shit about people all the time. It's such bullshit, right? So it's a. Uh, it's funny. It's niceties. It's political niceties, really. What it is. Anyway, digression. And then I'm a professor. I'm an educator. Um, of film mostly. I've done education in other realms, mostly around the arts, but of film. But my background actually comes from theater. Acting is where I started. Music as well. And my introduction to politics does come from theater. Actually, I studied classical, quote unquote, theater um, in my, schooling. But due to the certain exposures that I had, I became introduced to people like Bertolt Brecht. I would say, if I had to say there were people who, other than, being introduced to someone like Malcolm X as like a teenager, and the Black Panthers, the people who really got me jived around politics and political thought were people like Brecht, were people like Amiri Baraka. I would say, and that's where my tentacles really got raised. And I realized there could be a marriage between the two. So then, whenever I would get into a new art form, like when I first got into cinema in a real deal way, I was like, well, where are the political people, you know? So then I found Battle of Algiers, I found Ponte Cervo, I later found Cinema Novo, the African filmmakers, Semben and things like that. And it all went from there. But yeah, but that's how I would introduce myself and my background. And I have various trips through many things there.
Yeah, like the filmmaker as the critic, as also somebody who does criticism is so crucial because I feel like it was so formative to my introduction to the arts. Like I'm also in a fairly ambiguous territory because I started off as a writer slash poet, and then I transitioned or transitioning in the process of transitioning to being a musician,
Hmm.
and like engaging in the audio realm, from being in the written realm and all of that. It's a completely different ball game, and so like it's a shaky ground for me to like start calling myself exactly that. Although putting an EP out is a way by which I've been able to call myself a musician.
Hmm.
But I do think that like the introduction into political filmmaking or any kind of political art form becomes almost like a bifurcation, like
Mm.
where you almost have to accept that as meritorious as art, as the non-political stuff, because the non-political stuff is actually the canon, right? The political stuff needs to meet the expectations and the definitions of the non-political stuff in order for it to even be accepted as art, as opposed to just as like a piece of propaganda, or something like that.
Yeah.
So what was the point where you watched or like interacted with any art form, not necessarily films, but whether it's films, music, books, you mentioned Amiri Baraka and Brecht, that led you to see that as like you'd watch something like Titanic and be like, that is, it doesn't even compute with something like, I mean, Battle of Algiers, you could even argue is as epic a film as Titanic because it's ambitious and it's I mean, there's the famous tracking shot and all of that.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, like even just bringing in all of these elements where political art, when did it start appearing as meritorious to you as the conventional stuff that's being the ones that people give awards to?
When I grew up, there was an acknowledgement that the political, let's say like political musical album was possibly the most important work of certain people. Just think something about like What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, right? You know, everyone would acknowledge, when I grew up at least, that Marvin Gaye had a plethora of music from, sexual healing to his early stuff on Motown with Tammy Terrell and so forth and so on. But What's Going On is the meaningful piece. And it's also a great piece of music. And I remember growing up in a home where that was heralded in that way, right? Uh, and then people like Bob Marley, not necessarily in my home. My father's not really a reggae lover, but people that I knew, Marley. I remember when I was in middle school, and then political rap, people like Public Enemy, and I came up in that era of listening to that, and that being having a certain that had a draw with me at a very young age. Honestly, I had a big draw with me, so. But I will also say that I did become a teenager. I got into the other stuff, but there was this thing where wisdom. First it was wisdom for me, right? Like Wu Tang. I was into like the wise stuff, very metaphysical stuff. That while I enjoy Wu Tang emotionally when I'm at the gym, the metaphysical messaging doesn't do much for me anymore. It's just not my wheelhouse of thought. When I got a bit older, towards the end of my high schooling years, I had noticed that I developed a dissonance with popular culture as it was. I had a lot of questions about it, partly because I was looking at the conditions around me where I grew up here in New York, and I also was very into that kind of, mainstream hip hop is BS, so forth and so on. So I was like developing a political code within me. It was very unrefined, very, very, very sloppy. It didn't have any real grounding. And then I discovered the Panthers. I told someone, I said I went to my library in high school looking for a book, and I saw Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, which to this day it was like sticking there. And I looked at the takeout card, and it hadn't been taken out since like the late '80s. It had been sitting in there, and this was like what, like 96, 97. So I grabbed the book, I take it with me, and around that time I had a friend who was interested. He's a little older than me. He was interested in Black Arts Movement plays, so he gave me a copy of Dutchman by Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka to read, and he took me through some things. And that, the way it had a utility of being so powerful in a way that was immediate, and it was similar to the best of the political hip hop or the political music that I said, like, like that great Bob I Shot the Sheriff. I'm reading Dutchman, and I'm like, that has I Shot the Sheriff energy, right? That has Chuck D, bring the noise. I was like, this is what I want. This is the theater that I want to be a part of. And why is it not out there? I got introduced to Baldwin's Blues to Mr. Charlie. That was the very first thing of Baldwin that I actually ever read. I never read any of his other books until I saw that. I did a production of that play at like 19. So it was the theater, the theatrical works. And then cinema became a thing slightly after, because I kind of dipped in there through theater, because but also through literature, because I remember one of the first was like the Spook Who Sat by the Door film. And the other the other thing that happened with a lot of these films is, this is pre-internet, is they were these rare finds, right? Have you seen the Spook by the Door movie? And they'll be like, no. Do you have a copy? No, but you got to go find it. So you go to somewhere like Kim's Video, and you're trying to excavate these secret things, these secret toys and pieces, and they became pieces of intrigue. And then when you got a hold of them, then you were just uh you know bombarded with not only great art, but an energy that you did not get watching mainstream movies. And I think they're growing up in the environment that I did. While it's not that I couldn't appreciate some of the glamour or get into some of the high production values of Hollywood, but I didn't come from high production value in my life, right? It's not a whatchamacallit, a representation argument that I'm trying to make, as much as a recognition. What was recognizable to me, right? And I was like, oh well, this is recognizable to me, and I can get into it. And also it's weird. I remember I first saw Ganja and Hess when I was like 21, and I did not understand it at all. But the fact that it was weird, it had appeal. It could have been an era and a generational thing. And then once I got to college, also because I was studying theater and I was reading,
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Purchase. I studied in the BFA acting program there, and
But are
and
you you also teach at Purchase, right?
yeah, I teach in a totally different program, which
Oh,
is like
different program. Okay.
ironic.
Same.
Yeah, but I teach in the film program, but I went to the acting program. It's actually quite funny.
Wild.
Yeah, but one of the things that happened also in college was I I then became really obsessed with black plays once I got there. And not just the black plays that were being produced. Like August Wilson was all the rage by that time. And I didn't have anything against August Wilson, but I had discovered Baraka and people like Ed Bullins, Black Arts Movement, even some of the early works of Langston Hughes, like his play Mulatto, which is an incredible work. And I was like, I want to do this stuff, and they wouldn't let me do it in school.
Like they wouldn't let you stage the plays, is what
They
you're
would,
saying?
yeah, like so we would do scene study, and our first teacher, who we named Eulalie Noble, she had this very rigid, very group theater, Strasberg-esque um, plan of attack and how she trained her students. So the first semester was Arthur Miller, which, like, I'll be honest with you, I've Miller to me has always been a bit flat. Even his most, well, like the Crucible and maybe like After the Fall are like his most like peaking energy pieces. And I
Is he
found
Death of a Salesman? Is he?
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the one that I read.
I just don't. And she forced me to do a scene from Death of a Salesman. I had to play happy. And I was like I said this is bullshit. I hated it. And I couldn't stand it and I did terribly. The second semester what was interesting is she was like we do Clifford Odets. And I got into Odets waiting for Lefty because it's all labor plays. And I had a familiarity with Odette because I saw the play coincidentally when I was a teenager, and I was really hit by it. I come from a family of laborers and things like that, so something probably clicked in me that I couldn't understand. So I got into that. I was like, yeah, waiting for Lefty. I was like, this is cool. And then what I did was I started reading kind of the histories of Odets and the group theater, and they were all communists. And this was connected to other readings that I was doing at the time of like the Panthers. So things were like starting to like connect. Like I say, still very sloppy, not a lot of strong linkage is made. I also didn't really have good political advisors at the time, so I didn't know what to do, but I was into the plethora. But the thing that really stuck was I still couldn't do anyone black and political, right? And that lit a fire unto me because it was forbidden. It was a forbidden thing, which then keyed me into that this must be dangerous to the status quo. And
They wouldn't let you do August Wilson either.
Wilson, yes. So
Okay.
that ended up being that ended up being their compromise. At
Okay.
first, no, with her. The teacher that I ended up having after that, though, she let me do Blues for Mr. Charlie. So we had it because it became a big blow up between a bunch of the students. I kind of was the catalyst, and other students kind of jumped in. And then when I got to the second year, the teacher said, I heard, and she liked Wilson, but I asked her, could I do Blues to Mr. Charlie? Now, what was interesting is this teacher, interesting woman, name was Joan Potter, actually a great acting professor. Um, I'd be curious if she was still alive, what her thoughts on around me now would be, but it's very interesting. We actually had a very good working relationship. But she knew Baldwin, and she actually remembers the production of Bruce and Mr. Charlie that they did via Strasberg and all that. I think it wasn't Kazan. Was it Kazan who directed it? I forget who directed it. And she loved the play, and she hadn't thought about it in a while. And she was like, "Oh, you can definitely do that in my class." So it ended up being a compromise. And then we went to did Chekhov the second semester, which I wasn't opposed to because I actually found Chekhov interesting just because of my like. I also had a a quiet fascination then with Russia and the Soviet Union, and I know Chekhov is pre-Soviet Union, but the play that I picked was The Cherry Orchard, which is kind of about the preview of the end of the bourgeoisie of in Russia. So I was like, ooh, it'll pique my interest, of those kinds of tales and histories. So I was on a constant search, and that search sometimes led me weirder pathways. I definitely dabbled with some of the more metaphysical stuff that I don't totally oppose to, like Grotowski, who I still have a great amount of respect for. Some of Grotowski's, I don't know, predilections are a bit odd to me, but I do think as a training model and a way of thinking about theater as a form, I do think there's a lot of utility and importance in it. Um, he's too much of a monk for me. Like, the idea that we should all separate and go off and become these monks in a corner. I think in a political world that is dangerous. I do see. If we were in a more like evolved socialist world, I could see the utility of these monks who hold, knowledge together, and they aren't an enclave, and we go and visit them. I get that research. He called it research center, but I remember I was plotting about joining one of his, well, really his research center that was existing after he passed away, and while I loved their work. I fell in love with the work. I went and did it in Italy when I was about 21. The thing that ringed at the top of my head was what utility does me becoming a monk in the middle of Italy have for the rest of the world? And I couldn't. And when I asked that question to them, they seemed to judge me.
And
So
when you
I
say they, you mean the people at the.
At the theater, yeah.
Okay.
At the theater. Thomas Richards, who was actually the son of Lloyd Richards, which is very interesting. Lloyd Richards, being a super establishment theater director, his son went off to become a monk. Well, one of his sons went off to become a monk and head Grotowski's theater, which honestly is like I hope someone writes a book about that because that's deep because and Thomas great guy, great theater artist and a lot of respect for the things that he's done. I do have political questions around it as a as a as a a form of and a way of approaching things. But and that's really where it's. But I definitely spent a long time dabbled between those two questions, right? But I always ended up landing back to the more ones who wanted to be active in a political world because they were doing the real to me material analysis of and that's really what it comes from. They were doing material analysis and the art was being produced from that. And that to me felt the most true rather than these kind of metaphysical kind of approaches to things that often felt lofty, um, all types of to me too strange, uncommitted people could latch onto it and I always found myself very much in this kind of fight when I had to be around too many energies that I did not feel genuinely cared.
How much do you think your particular interest in like the material aspects of politics, especially materialist analysis, comes from the fact that your problems in filmmaking to get movies made, to get films made, it's a materially challenging process where you didn't just get recruited by somebody, you didn't sign a check.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody didn't sign a check for you and then say, here's $50 million. I just saw an interview of Abel Ferrara
Do you remember
talking
how
in New
big was
York,
the
and he
budget
was like
of the
The
film?
saying
budget
something
was
to
like
his
$5-6 million.
and said, "Here's a
All
check
right,
for
we went
X
to
million
Italy,
dollars,"
had
and he
lunch,
even
and
laughed,
somebody
saying,
gave us a check
"People
for
don't really
five
say
million.
that anymore."
Imagine
And
that.
it was funny, and like
Okay,
obviously
those
that's
days are
not
over,
how
guys.
it
Forget it.
happened. So you didn't get the sort of as the proverbial blank check to just go and do whatever you want with it because your challenges are more immediately
Hmm.
uh, material in nature to get films made. Do you think like that influenced your politics of filmmaking as well? And like, use this opportunity to talk about how you actually got into filmmaking, how you got your first movie made, etc.
So I'll say this filmmaking made me a committed materialist. So, yes, in that way, it was like the final straw. I believe I was always on the toes of it with my acting career because I fought a lot as an actor. The the wants that I had as an actor were not in unison to what business culture was offering. And I had a constant tension and I was in a constant dissonance with that. I remember an old agent of mine and she's a liberal, but she was a very nice lady. Well, the only nice agent I ever had. She made a comment to me that she said to me, she said, Mtume, the things that you're interested in, Hollywood does not produce. So she said, I don't say that to like get with it, kid, as much as she was trying to tell me that you either is going to have to try to make a bunch of money and then do the things that you want on the side or quit. She really told me like this is really what you have to do. But she said even in making the money, I would have to hide who I am. And I was like, ooh, wow, that was really deep. And then I got into the music world, the hip hop world, and the hip hop world I actually think is where I lost all faith in uh art art being an artist through capital through capitalism, and I had to do a kind of analysis of my material reality. As I was in the underground hip hop world, that you know, basically we were all like a bunch of like football coaches cheering each other on. It's like we will win. Yeah, 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 yeah. We're gonna beat the system, and living in these kinds of imaginings that we were, you know, and not that we weren't. We were the real core of hip hop culture, and then one day everyone would recognize it, which was just a false, youthful, exuberant dream. Really, it was not based on any real analysis. Because then, when it didn't happen for all of us, for most of us, we were kind of just left in the lurch. Like, well, what do we do with this? So I had to do an analysis. It pushed me. Some people that I know went to more metaphysical analyses about it. Oh well, my time will come, and it's just the ebb and flow and things like that. And these things have never worked for me. They just don't work, right? When I hear them, it's mysticism. I'm not a mystic. I never have. I became an atheist in my 20s. I couldn't I just couldn't vibe with it. So then I had to start doing things. And it's funny, I would always then go back, right? I would leave Marxist or Marxist influenced texts for like a year or two. And then at my lowest moment, I would go pick up Black Skin, White Masks or Wretched of the Earth, right? I'd go back to it. I remember I had this really low moment with like the hip hop world, and it was right around when Hugo Chavez went to the UN and I think he gave Bush the open veins of Latin America. And I went to the bookstore and just grabbed it and read it. I was in this low moment because I said, well, Chavez, I know he will say, why are we here? Right. And that's what happened. And I had a big trip through Europe for a while. I did that for some time. I did the European thing, and even that was complicated for myself. And but I was able to see the world, which I was very happy about. But I had to also push back against that as I kept capitalism kept rearing its head. I could not escape it. I went to Spain thinking I could escape capitalism, and it was just absolutely stupid, right? And by the time I wrestled back here in the States, I said, well, I'm going to get into filmmaking. But I did not get into filmmaking thinking I would be able to compromise with Hollywood ever. Right. I actually knew that. There was never an aim to do that. Where I made a miscalculation is in what Abel Ferrara, you just told me about, realized. The miscalculation was the independent world that he existed in does not exist anymore. And I'll
Mm.
say one last thing about the Ferrara thing. I know someone who used to work with him, and I forget which film. It might have been Driller Killer or it might have been Miss 45. I'd have to get a clarification from him. But he told me there were at least two or three times during the filming of the film where Abel told people we might not go back on set tomorrow, right? And he had to go find some money, right? And he said he remembers one time some dude just walked on set with a suitcase, and Abel found money in all kinds of interesting ways, right? But that doesn't exist anymore. I acted in kind of that beginning of the end of the Sundance era, and I kind of saw it firsthand. So by the time I became a filmmaker, I wholly recognized, and like, look, I was totally fine. Be I wanted to be an independent filmmaker. I came into film wanting to be completely independent. But what I realized was the apparatus had changed. But also I do think part of the apparatus change is that independent film as we know it has become completely depoliticized. There was a politicization to independent film culture for
Right.
a very long time, and not necessarily everybody had great politics, but there was a recognition that politics exists implicitly within independent filmmaking, and that's gone. I mean, we could say what killed it. Maybe like mumblecore was like the final death blow to a kind of political recognition of independent film. I mean, Glober Rocha has this great quote that he says, when he says independent film is a political reality or something like that. I can find it, but yeah, it's true. And
I feel like
so
the notion of independent film, at least to me, and I want to ask you this as a question, just like goes back to the new wave, and the fact that like those were the guys who were critics, who were also filmmakers. Basically, they were subverting the existing norm by like talking about it and then like doing something completely different and blowing people's minds. And I think like that existed as a sort of culture for a while, like where the incoming crop of filmmakers actually were very vocal critics of what preceded them. One of the things that you shared once that I remember is this big piece by Filmmaker magazine about the shape and the makeup of the independent film industry at the moment. And I mean, we can't off the top of the head, up off the top of our heads, fully do justice to the piece. But can you, using maybe even that piece as a reference as well as
mhm.
your own experience, lay out what the independent film industry is like right now?
Hmm.
Uh, what like talk about the farm to table of the independent film industry.
So the way the independent film industry works now is it is essentially an unofficial minor leagues for Hollywood, but it's a minor leagues that doesn't have a governing body, right? You know, if you think about like if you use a sports analogy, the G League, right? They have a governing body that kind of monitors and a system of how you get players to go into the NBA or the minor leagues, or like that's probably the more sophisticated one is something like baseball, right? It's a very sophisticated kind of way that you draft people up in, or if you draft, or a team drafts a player, send them to a minor league to develop and go off. And maybe, there were maybe iterations like it with like the studio system in Hollywood, so forth and so on. Independent film today is comprised of filmmakers whose options have been told to get into film, you have to go through these various kind of gateways. One of the gateways is film school, right? So you have these film schools. Most of them are private colleges where you spend an absorbent amount of money to get into it, right? And to graduate through. You know, I teach at one of the few state schools, and one of the few bachelor's, non-master's programs. But a lot of times places like NYU, Columbia, AFI, you're paying a tons of money, and these are mostly young people who who come from money who are entering these schools. So that's one thing to kind of put. So you have that. Then you have the film festival system. And film festivals are not necessarily new, but their attitude has changed. Film festival is funny. I about gosh, maybe about 8 years ago, I went to a film festival, and Adam Egoyan was one of the um judges. A very nice guy, actually. I'll say a funny joke about him. I was trying to get in to see a documentary, right? And he had two seats, and like the line was super like long. And I got there like right on time. I was like, shit, I'm not gonna go see it. And he saw me because he saw me at his previous talk. So he says, "You want to go in to see this?" He said, "Yeah, you can come in with me." I was like, "Sure." He says, "Don't tell anybody that Adam Agoya never did anything for you." And I cracked up. I said, "No, the streets are gonna talk good about you, Adam. I got you." So look, I'm doing it right now. Um,
Nice.
but that talk, he said something very interesting. He's on a lot of juries these days, and recently he was asked to jury one of the kind of newer filmmaker kind of categories. And he said he watched five films. He says they were technically excellent, very expensive. They looked great, but he says all five of them were dull. And he asked the people, he said, "Look, can you find me another film? Right? I just don't like any of them." And he says, I think they're dull. And he said, we have to get past this need for technical expertise. And he made the comment that it's all like people trying to make short films to audition for Hollywood. So the part of the issue with independent filmmaking is no one actually wants to be an independent filmmaker. They want
Hmm.
to graduate to go on to become you know, uh, Christopher Nolan, right? I mean, this is an argument that made me leave Twitter about Greta Gerwig that I had. I said, look, Greta Gerwig and all those mumblecore people, they did the independent thing as a marketing tool to get themselves Hollywood jobs eventually,
Right.
right? This is not John Sayles,
Right.
right? If you listen to John Sayles, Sayles has a much different perspective on what independent film is.
It's not even Kevin Smith.
Not even Kevin Smith, right?
Yeah.
Right? And and people got on me about the Gerwig thing. Oh no, no. So even saying she has an independent spirit. And I was like, what the fuck does that mean? That is just so lofty and in the air, man. I was like, dude, that does not mean anything, right? And then I also said, and then I remember I said, I think John Cassavetes would disagree about her independent spirit. And then they go, oh, there you go. You're going to bring in Cassavetes. You're going to bring in a guy. And I was like, you know what? Exactly. Well, then Jenna Rollins wouldn't have said that either. But when I say no one wants to be an independent filmmaker, I mean the majority of people who are ushered into film, right? Who are ushered into the world. But then what happens even with that is there becomes a cannibalism, right? It becomes a competition.
Hmm.
And who wins out? The people with resources. So one of the things that I had noticed very, very early on, I my first film Spit, I made it and it went and screened at Aspen Shorts Fest. I kind of got into that by a happenstance. It's like a really long story. Um, but it was like this way that I stumbled into peeking into how the other half lived because the majority of these people who were there came from elite film schools. I didn't go to film school. They came from elite film schools, or they had lots of resources, or both, right? The judges were from film schools and things like that, or they come from families and so forth and so on. And I rode, we didn't, we, I rode a plane with someone. We weren't seating together, but we had to do our weight. The plane was delayed with a woman who was a producer. And I knew she was a producer of one of the films. So I was like, well, let me do the whole, try to see if she's interested in anything. And she explicitly told me, she says, look, I'm a film producer and my money comes from white country clubs. And I saw your film. She said, I liked it very much. I just don't think they would be interested in any of that. And I was like, oh. And then I saw the film that she did, and her whole pitch of her company is a very kind of, Sheryl Sandberg style of, a woman empowerment type stuff and very liberal feminist stuff. And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay. Curious, right? Everything she does is it's it's either white and then if it's women of color, it's like the most detached from anything political. It's like, women get to work type stuff, right? Very, 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 very like that. And that's what she gets money from her country club folks. And that was my first preview to then what I saw became constant. There is a resource thing where you have the resources. And the system that exists now because of this kind of resource issue, because there's also an economic issue. Films are not profitable. There is a profit issue in movies that go even beyond the independent structure. We could even get into the Hollywood structure. So there used to be a time probably where you were in the best health of the film world where you were able to sell your film at multiple film festivals, and now it's being bottlenecked to one to a few film festivals. Really, Sundance, Cannes, Venice, Berlin. You can sell a film at these days. Um, and South by Southwest, not really anymore. I don't. I haven't heard of films being sold there. There was like a big peak where people were selling films at South by Southwest, but that's not really happening much anymore. And then, places like Toronto Film Festival, New York Film Festival have become presenting festivals. They're not even showing films that don't have distributors. Except for some of their smaller programs. Like I know New York Film Festival is so committed to doing an experimental program, right? Which is good. And I think, Toronto still has Canadian films, a Canadian film section. And I know a few of those films don't have distributors because a producer I used to work with is Canadian and he produced a film that didn't have a major distributor in it. So, but if you're an American film going there, it's basically going to be presenting what's going to be on the fall slate, right? For A24, even higher than that. Honestly, sometimes for things like Fox, Searchlight, and various, groupings. So if you have the resources, if you have the connections, you can get stuff done. I'll tell you this. I was going to shoot a feature film 5 years ago, right before COVID. I was it looked like the money was in, and one of the people who was going to be an investor on the film, he admitted to me that he had connections at Sundance that basically, if I became his producer, he would have a really good chance of me getting a slot there. Right. And because a lot of what happens is basically you have these people who exist as financiers who have connections with it. They know they want to get their film sold. They know who the programmers are, and they're able to kind of usher these things in. Does everyone get in? No, but the ones that do get in do have that arrangement. Right.
Right.
And that is the deal. So you're dealing with a system that has financial problems that people don't want to actually just be independent and buck the trend and say, let's go figure out a whole new thing. They want to funnel into the Hollywood system in any way that they can. So they're going into this very, very, very wicked, barbaric territory and just being as underhanded as they can be, right? And what did the article call them? Golden elevator films, right? He's like, if these films are getting somewhere, they have a benefactor that has liquid funds, right? The irony, though, and I think the article slightly touched on this, is that some of those films aren't making money either, and that is also an issue, right? So what I did like about the article, and this is something that I've had a conversation with a few young people, young filmmakers recently, is it did show that people who try to emulate, because the other thing that people will then do is like, well, let me crowd fund a $500,000 movie. But making a $500,000 movie within the Hollywood structure is actually a bit of a death knell because it's hard to make that money back. So unless you crowdfund it completely without any commitments, you'll probably be okay, right? But if you get that $500,000 from someone, it's going to be pretty hard for you to get back the money. So their message actually was to shoot cheaper,
Hmm.
right? Was to shoot a lot cheaper,
Or more expensive.
yeah,
So
or
it's like
more,
basically, yeah, they basically, I feel like they put it into, I mean, I'm remembering off the top of my head as well, like that they
yeah.
were basically just saying
You're absolutely
that
right.
it either has to be absolutely shoestring or it needs to be, I think they said it had to be over $10 million or
Yeah,
something like that,
yeah.
or
And look, I so when the film that I was gonna make failed, right? It didn't happen. I lost the funding because of COVID. We did like I basically took off a year and a half from it, right? I talked to a few producers during the pandemic, but it just didn't during the lockdown of the pandemic, I'll say, and it didn't work. When I got out of it, I had a meeting with a producer. Someone sent him my script, and he liked it, and he said, "Let's have a coffee." And we had a coffee, and I wanted to shoot that film originally for what was it, 300. Then because of how everything went because of COVID, the new protections that were going to be needed, I said, can we double it? Maybe make it like 800. He said to me flat out, look, I like your film, but you have to raise it to $5 million minimum. And I was like, why? I said, just tell me why. I was like, I don't need $5 million. I was like, give me $5 million, I'll make like 10 films. I was like, yeah, give me 5 million. Can I make like 10 films with it, or three or something like that? And his answer was, it's because of the economics of movies. You have to shoot it for over this. He says, I actually don't do films for less than 5 million. I'm sitting here trying to convince you to do it that way. Now, then my next question was, well, do you have $5 million? Oh no, we have to raise it. And I said, how long will it raise? He said like 2 million. That's 2 years. I was like, you know what, dude? Like, nah. Because I looked at his track record and I didn't necessarily see the ability to do it. And also, I also thought to myself, getting into that kind of arrangement, because I have had other friends, is eventually a death knell. Because what also happens when you do that is you lose your film. Look, I've had friends recently who've gotten their first features made, and it is pretty remarkable when I look at the script that they originally started with, then the script that they submit once it goes through the system of whatever studio or boutique studio they worked with, and what the film that comes out. I'm like, oh wow, okay. They really told you can't do this and that.
Would you be able to, I mean, unless this gets into like really NDA territory and stuff like that, would you be able to give me some examples of stuff that got cut out like that?
Um, I don't have any specifics. It's more like a tonality thing that I would say, if I can think about it. Like it's like you watch the tonalities of films, and they have difference. And look, you know what's interesting is because the filmmaker will also acknowledge it, but then they'll kind of like chalk it up as like a plus because look, they got their film made. And now they're able to kind of sit down with high rollers. But that goes back to my original point. They didn't want to be independent in the first place. They want to be working filmmakers. And this kind of goes back to the politics of it all. Independent film for me is not about being a worker, though I do acknowledge labor. It's about a great not a greater, it's about another kind of social relationship, right? It's a different social relationship that I would like to establish, right? Which then made me reconsider even how to even approach making films completely.
So I feel like the filmmaker and in here like we're getting into author theory territory where the filmmaker is seen as you can either see the filmmaker as a CEO or as an independent business owner who's like basically got their own like Francis Ford Coppola doing the Megalopolis is a great example
Yeah.
where he ran a whole business and raised money to make this movie, which I don't know how it's doing actually, but it's a great example of somebody who just wanted to be independent, didn't want to, or like maybe didn't have the opportunity to find anybody to finance the movie, and so on. I saw this nice kind of categorization that Quentin Tarantino did recently. I've always seen him as a savvy guy because like
Mhm.
it takes speaking of somebody who is independent or a worker, I feel like he's somebody who kind of at least like for all the shit politics that he has, etc. At least like manages to do whatever the fuck he wants to do, and I feel like that's
Mhm.
a at least something that you can say about him. And he said something which was very fascinating. He said,
What's your analysis of current state of cinema?
It makes the 80s look fucking great. We're living through another repressive time when it comes to cinema. First really big repressive time was the 50s. Then we skipped a generation with the 60s, but then we got the 70s, and then then the pendulum had to swing
Swing the
back
other way,
again
right.
for the 80s, and then the pendulum swung the other way again for the 90s. I mean, I lived through the 90s, making movies in the 90s. I didn't consider the 90s the 70s part two, but
Right.
it was.
Yeah.
In retrospect, it absolutely was. Now the pendulum has swung this way again. I'm just waiting for the pendulum to swing back to
Yeah, me too.
sort of repressiveness like or like and then maybe now we're in a sort of it should have been at least like I would have thought a more Occupy inspired sort of defiant era, but I can also and again like to throw in this other complicating factor, another transition that happens between 50s to 80s to 20 to the 2000s is the transition from TV to mass media
Mhm.
to then streaming, to TV to DVD to streaming, and then basically the way by which we're experiencing films, and the contentification of films has also happened at the same time. So would you be able to speak to this, where the evolution of kind of cinema in the US has always had this ebb and flow, where there was a period of repression and then there's the
Hmm.
breakout, period of repression and the breakout, and then where do you see that uh, at the current moment, where, as you say, there's a golden elevator, which clearly implies a sort of almost Hays Code type of situation going on, an unspoken Hays Code type of
Yeah.
situation.
I hate to say this. I have some agreement with Tarantino, but I actually think his analysis is actually a bit tepid. I think it's actually even worse for several reasons. There's a few things he might acknowledge these things, but there's a couple of them he's maybe he's missing. Um, so if you think about the 50s is the post World War II environment, right? America Cold War, they're needing to win the propaganda game against the USSR. And this is the thing, the growing global affection for the USSR. I think that's a thing that people underestimate. It's one of the things that I did not like soundtrack of a coup d'etat, but it's one of the things that they do point out is that there was a growing affection towards communism in parts of the U.S. Well, mostly outside of the U.S. We're talking about the developing world, the third world, whatever word you want to use. But and I think they had grand fears that it would splinter into the U.S. So they had to strengthen the propaganda game in the 50s. Um, the 60s became an issue because Hollywood began to lose money, right? And the people don't give enough credit to the financial failures of the 60s changing the film industry. It was a material condition thing. The studios couldn't keep their doors open. So they had to turn to New Hollywood. They had to. They were forced. It was not something that they wanted to do. They were just like, "Shit, what the hell? Yes, go make Bonnie and Clyde. We, you have to go do it." And then you have the 70s, right? And then you have the 70s come on, and they needed it to survive. It's funny. I There's this great Robert Altman story that I tell people. You can see it in the documentary about him. I forgot what film he did. It was one of the last studio films he did before he did MASH, and it was when he was first experimenting with his sound recording, where he would do the overlap and people would speak into stuff like that because and the sound person told him, was like, Robert, you can't really do that, man. Like they're gonna get like pissed and da 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 da. He's like, whatever, it's gonna be great, right? He goes back to the studio the next day and he's not even let on the lot. He's fired. Like this guy was persona non grata. They told him you will never work in the studios again. Then MASH. They needed him. They had to grab him back. They had to bring him back. They were forced, right? They needed to bring this person back. So the 70s became a material thing, but then you had Star Wars in the late 70s. Studios were back. They were healthy again. The one thing I would disagree with Tarantino about the 80s is, yes, the studio-wise, the bigger films became very repressive, but there was a subculture in genre films that existed in the 80s, right? People like Carpenter, stuff like that, and they didn't care. They liked that little extra cash that they were making with these movies, right? And also because they were all coded with stuff like that. Though there was also even some of those genre films from the 80s, some right wing stuff, people like John Milius, like Red Dawn and movies like that. It was a bit of a wild west out there, but there was a way you could splinter some of that stuff out through the 80s. That I only bring that up to say that now you don't even have that.
Right.
Now you don't even have that. You keep going, and then you have the 90s, and 90s became the kind of a new cool kid era of movie making. They also tried to utilize identity a lot, so like Black Hollywood. Alfre Woodard, she did say something that I thought was interesting that I never really tried to materially look, but it sounded correct. She says they asked her about a couple years ago about like this like black renaissance that was happening in movie making a couple years ago. She goes, "Oh my God, I've lived through three black renaissances in movie making." Right? She's like, "Get the fuck out of here." She's like, "It happens whenever they need it. Like, they come back and they pull it." And she was like, "Please get out my face with that." She was so dejected about like and so angry at the question. And I was like, I respected it because usually people like revel in that. You get someone like Issa Rae and it's her, oh yeah, Alfred was like, get out of here, get out of my face. I've been through so many of these, right? It'll be over again, and then it'll be another Black Renaissance, right? So then you get in through the 90s, it became the kind of hip cool kid era, so forth and so on. But I also think you have to talk about the rise of um, collegiate filmmaking. A lot of where these people may, I watched the interview with David Lynch, and they asked about when he went to AFI. He said it was like he said, dude, it was nothing. They barely taught us anything. He said it was free. They said it was a free for all. He said we were kind of teaching each other,
Hmm.
and we were like watching wild films. That's a thing about the '60s and '70s filmmakers, the Coppolas, the Scorseses. I mean, I do have a criticism about what I'm about to say with them. Also, but they were watching the new wave and stuff like that. I mean, look, there's a
I got
video
Glabra Rocha I met over the
of
years, and I
Scorsese
started
talking
making
about
films. There's no
Main
doubt
Street
Antonio
Cinema
Dos
for the
Mortos had
movie
like
about
a
watching
major impact on Mean Streets.
Land and
And on
Anguish.
Raging Bull. On Raging Bull, we put in
He
some
says that
Brazilian music
there's a famous shot
in homage
of towards the
to
end
Glabra.
where
There's
De
a couple
Niro's
of pieces of music in there.
that famous shot before they get in the car and they get shot, right? He says that's lifted from Land and Anguish. And it's true. It's the wide shots of the opening when he's talking to his mother. It's the same thing. He's just using that aesthetic. So they were going into the political and to these very 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 subversive filmmakers and taking from them and utilizing it and kind of playing with it. So they had a relationship to it, but they also acknowledged when they were in film school a lot was about experimenting. By the time the next few generations came, you had people who were being trained how to become Hollywood filmmakers.
Hmm.
So the training became about a very specific way of how to go in. When you go, I have plenty of people I know who have gone to these film schools, and when I hear about their training, it's systematized. It's about making you into a automaton of of the film world. You go in there and you are the robot who knows how to work well. So as time goes on, these filmmakers, and I think every 5 to 10 years it gets worse. People like Fincher, who I think went to USC, if I remember correctly, right? He's kind of one iteration of learning, and then you get someone like Justin Simeon later, who's also went to USC. He's even worse. He's even more watered down.
Hmm.
Ryan, same thing with like Ryan Coogler. He's even more watered down. He's system. I mean, look, Ryan Coogler met the guy for several times. Nicest individual, really, 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 really nice guy. But he is someone. The reason why Ryan Coogler is successful is because he thinks about what Hollywood wants before they ask him.
Right.
Doing Creed was his idea. This wasn't he didn't make Fruitvale Station, right? And they go, "Hey, can you make Creed?" And he
Wow.
and he, and he go, "Oh yeah, you know what? I'll just do it." No, they were like, what movie do you want to make? I want to continue Rocky. I mean,
I mean, I can see, the wild thing is I actually quite enjoyed one of the Creeds. I think I
mm-hmm.
definitely liked I didn't even watch the third one. I
Neither
kind
have
of liked
I.
the second. I like the second one because he brought back Drogo, and
Yeah.
there was an interesting relationship between father and son that was mirrored. And it was a very interesting play.
Uh-huh.
It didn't. The funny thing about Creed 2 is that it didn't racialize either of those boxers. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
neither of them, like, he didn't seem like he was a white boxer. He didn't seem like he was a black boxer necessarily. And Rocky was
Mm-hmm.
playing the father figure and so on. And of course, like, man, you can't forget that he's probably it was his idea similarly to make Black Panther as well. I would imagine. But yeah, no, I mean, like, here I do have to bring up the point about one thing that Quentin Tarantino did address, like, to the point that we've been talking about, is
It can't even be compared to Abel Ferrara's next movie, The Bad Lieutenant, because The Bad Lieutenant exists in an art house world. This is still in the exploitation movie world.
Yeah.
It doesn't have it has the patina of this great look and these magnificent actors and all this stuff, but it is in this exploitation-y. No, our job is to make a big violent crime film that black folks are gonna dig.
Right.
And that's what it is, and that's what it does. And it's not trying to be Scorsese. Seems like a weird stepchild of Goodfellas from the same year. It has a more down market, disreputable B-movie vibe to it.
It also played into the exploitation era aesthetic, and the themes and the treatment, and so on, and kind of almost resembled, as he said, a B movie, rather than a traditional trying to be like a filmmaking formalist experiment, which was fascinating to me, and I really like the distinction here, where the catering to a black audience is seen as a lesser than.
100%,
Sort
yeah.
of right, and it's like, and it's funny because like Tarantino is the guy who broke that barrier. I feel like, where he's the person who made pulp. I mean, the thesis of Pulp Fiction itself, like the notion or concept of Pulp Fiction, is that it is not, literary fiction. It is pulpy. It's not fully formed, and it's not as formalistically accomplished, you could argue, and yet like it works. It's looser. It's got a lot more elements in it that it maybe doesn't need, but it still has it, and so on. It's and like these are all like elements that serve to entertain the audience more than anything else, and the audience kind of validates the work. So I don't know. It seems like an interesting way of analyzing audiences, and how the audience determines the caliber of the filmmaking, where
What?
like it is meritorious if it's like catering to a white audience, whereas if
Hmm.
it's catering to a black audience, it's a B movie. That was fascinating to me.
I think it's like uh, a mid to late 80s phenomenon. So one of the big themes in the 80s was visiting the 60s consistently, right? Vietnam War, going into early 90s, even the early 90s, shows like The Wonder Years, Oliver Stone, a big gulp of Oliver Stone's career was what, like 5 or 6 straight films about the 60s, right? From Born on the Fourth of July to Platoon, you know, all the Vietnam like films, like I said, and different kinds of things. So, but of course, these are essentially forgeries of history. A lot of them, they're weird viewpoints. But America got into them. America was really into either these strange nostalgias of history. And Tarantino, I think, comes in at a time where they needed a new forgery, and one that wasn't somewhat political. Because one of the things about Stone, and I have my big criticisms of Oliver Stone, there is always a political air to his work. But people liked reveling in the past and in this kind of forgery of the past. So what Tarantino did was, well, look, how can I make the past, and the fact that the past was like this Manichaean crazy place, and how can I appropriate it for now and give you all the things, make it dirty, make it exciting, um, all the things that you would love to do, to be able to do, like say the N word to a black person and them not punch you in the face. Right? I'm gonna let you do that, right? And I'm gonna it's going to be this surrogate, cosplay that we can kind of venture into, and which I think really categorizes the 90s in a really interesting way. And then going into now, the 90s was the beginning of, I think, a total acceptance of a pop cultured a history would lead movies. right? It's not that America wasn't dabbling in a history before. Like, look, I mean, it's true, but this is a new kind of thing, right? And people know that this history isn't real, and they don't care because they see history as something that they can play with, like it's a child's toy, right? It's a they they actually would rather not have truth, right? I once said to someone about blaxploitation why I didn't like it. I remember this guy, he loves it. He's white. And he said, "Well, why don't you like blaxploitation?" And I said, "Well, you know, Foxy Brown is an appropriation of Angela Davis um to where they depoliticize her and sexualize her and make that black women power is like this kind of depoliticized, tough, sexualized goddess that we have to do, and that's problematic. Being who Angela was, and also it's an image of Angela too. Like they're taking the image of Angela. They're not even wrestling with Angela's complexities, Angela Davis's complexities, right? So, and his response to me was like, "Well, that doesn't matter. I mean, it's just movies." So
Right.
it's like movies. So movies to that generation. I think it's an '80s generation, from '80s kids, and maybe we could give some of that also to the genre films of the '80s as well. Maybe we have to give some of that blame or extension to that. I would have to think about that some more. But there was an acceptance that movies have no responsibility to reality actually at all.
Right.
We're actually movies' job is to make false reality. The more false the reality, the better you are.
Like the categorization of film as a formal experiment, like basically you arrived at the perfect form to tell the story. And I get it, man. Like, this is kind of basically my complaint with I feel like American art in general, and I feel like
Mm-hmm.
this is my problem with the ceiling. I think essentially, and this is kind of, I'm outing myself here. Like, I feel like there's a hard ceiling in the way that any award that you might see, and that's why, like, it's when American authors were frustrated that Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize before them. I was kind of, I was in glee because I was like happy that yes, he's absolutely better than you because he broke the. I mean, like, and he's not all that either. Like, that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
He's great. I mean, he's fine in his own regard, but like he has a ceiling himself, and he doesn't care. Like he does whatever the fuck he wants. Kind of like Tarantino, but at least, like, I would argue that Bob Dylan has done at least like had better politics in patches of his life. So yeah, I mean, when Bob Dylan won the Nobel, it kind of revealed to me in a sort of very clear sort of way, and this was 2016, that essentially what constituted poetry for in what constitutes American poetry, as is what constitutes American theater, or like American filmmaking or American music, is essentially the record, the documentation of the work in a
Mm-hmm.
sort of way. And so therefore, like, it's the formal representation of the object. And it's kind of like going back to the, Rene Magritte's
Mm-hmm.
like pipe and so on. It's like, this is not a pipe, etc. So it's like basically the formal representation, which can also have an ironic sort of flip side to it, where basically by like making it exactly what it should be given its form, you can still like convey the opposite idea, and therefore irony is like a constant device that they use and stuff like that. So it just seems to me that like that's a hard ceiling though, because sometimes I want to be wasteful, I feel like, in the way that I treat form. And I come from a culture where, like, song and dance. I grew up in India, like 25 until I was 25. So our films have song and dance in them in the middle. Like, this is an action movie, and suddenly while fighting the villain, the guy is dancing.
Right.
And it's a suspension of disbelief that you have to engage in, because that symbolism, it's not exactly real. It's a fantasy realm that he takes you into, and and it's still fine. You can still return to being in a completely realistic and gritty action movie after that,
Mm-hmm.
and still be okay. And somehow that would formally be, it's a musical rather than a serious drama movie. in the United States and so on. So like I feel like there's definitely the formal the tie to for something to have to be the lean mean the leanest and meanest form that it can be, and that is what is being appreciated, is a little feel like it's wasteful, and that's what's led to sort of like the Christopher Nolan Villanova kind of like everything. Matthew Vaughn, another example,
Mhm.
everything is just like it's like a music video filmmaking. It's like beat by
Yeah.
beat by beat by beat, and everything moves to a beat, and it's cool and all, but like sometimes it's not the effect that you're going for, I feel like, in a film.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. Like, there's a Simon Liang film that I love called is it the Wayward Cloud. And if people have seen his films, they're very slow. And you're basically watching people in relationships and places. And I had seen a bunch of his films that were just that. But then I watched The Wayward Cloud, and then suddenly there's like these song breaks. And it's like classic 80s like Taiwanese pop music. No, I think even early, I think it's like 60s Taiwanese pop music, right? It's just wild, right? I'm watching it like this is amazing, and it's totally tied into the film, but they become these kind of energetic breaks for the audience to kind of almost like Greek chorus style to kind of consider what they watched for the past like 30 minutes before, while they hear this like themized song of Chinese pop. It's great. It's really, really cool. Um, and this is the problem with genre, but this is the problem with the Western category system. Genre, we have to begin to acknowledge, does come from a longer project. One of the complications of Europeanism is the need to consistently categorize everything. That is aesthetics, right? What does it fall into? And then we have to also acknowledge that categorization is how domination happens. You're not this. You are less than because you don't fall into a category. You go into this, and cinema does suffer from that. I mean, all arts in the West suffer from that, from poetry to music. This need to genre things out for you to find a thing, and there's like a soft way that people talk about it. Oh, be trying to categorize me. I just want to be free. And yeah, okay. That's like the Taylor Swift version, right? What we need to begin to talk about is how categorization actually becomes a material problem in the development of art cultures. And it becomes a sign of domination of how you're able to dominate under a certain kind of cultural ethos and create codex that people have to operate in order to work, right? Because then what becomes the next thing? Then you become beholden to a genre, which not necessarily is always a bad thing, but then you become rigid, right? Well, now I'm this, and so forth and so on, and then it becomes about the genre. And sure, but this is cinema in the end of the day. This is music. What are we trying to do? If you were going to break, will you then be resistant to that because you have to kind of follow some kind of codec that was not set by you? You did not set these. You did not create these guidelines, right? And not saying that people haven't subverted it, but even they, like, I did once see an interview with Carpenter, and they tried to call him. He says, "Are you a horror filmmaker?" He was like, "Ah." And his whole thing was, I let them call me that because I had to get this shit made, But this is about a lot of other stuff.
This might just be me pathologizing or projecting my own baggage. This is because this is how I feel like I want to enter the scene. And this is what I'm drawn to naturally. This is what I saw like Godard do and Truffaut do at the time. And that was something that I saw work, and that was the most interesting part to me. Like more than the specific qualities of it, I could or could not be drawn the neorealists and so on. Like I'm more drawn. I feel like to the more neorealist tradition of
Hmm.
filming non-actors getting like really dirt cheap movies made, etc. But that said, I love the concept of basically entering the scene by critiquing all that's there before you, because you need to kind of defy the categorization, because the categorization is a canonization, as you're pointing out. Like, this is
Mm.
essentially like saying this is now a movie. And I keep going back, and this is like I mean, this could be the last point that we touch on, which is really good that we're, sort of ending on this note, because this is where I feel like you and I are finding alignment in a very interesting way. You brought up, and I want to set up the full context of it, because like I really want to touch on two movies that I think everybody hates universally, especially among like cinephiles
Hmm.
in the US, is American Beauty and Crash. Uh,
Yeah.
Two movies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now here's the thing, and don't particularly find either of these movies egregious, and
Hmm.
in comparison with all of the other movies like in that are made in the U. Like for example, I'm not. I mean, Avatar is like lauded fantastically. A lot of people love it, etc. For me, like Avatar isn't all that, and I don't think American Beauty or what's its name, Crash, is as egregious compared to other movies that are equally, like I can find to very shitty qualities about it, etc. And this was like a point of dissonance that led to a very illuminating moment with you, which is that I see these movies as not representing reality at all. Like
Mm-mm.
I am seeing them as conceptual, purely. Like they're allegorical to me almost entirely. Like the American Beauty families are not real families. Like in fact, like the fact that there's this weird kid taking the video with the handycam is to me almost like a representation of the filmmaker himself as a sort of like moral anchor. And similarly with Crash, I feel like the Turkish dad and all of these are like such obvious archetypes. It's such a Clint Eastwood movie, and it's no surprise that it's written by the guy who wrote Million Dollar Baby, which is a Clint Eastwood movie. So
Mm.
it really does like, strike me as a sort of Clint Eastwood movie, which is almost entirely always in parable. Like that's what Clint Eastwood makes. He makes parables. So I feel like both these movies kind of represent something that I find to be a larger kind of, I mean, if Clint Eastwood and Sam Mendes, who aren't like real super progressive filmmakers, that they themselves are like making this kind of allegorical slash conceptual movie, then there's no hope for the rest of the people, the liberal people who are to make any kind of like movie that depicts reality. Everybody is like making this Rob Reiner, Ron Howardified movie, which is like the characters are like reflecting a character that they had seen in a movie before rather than
Hmm.
somebody that they had seen in life. And this seems to be the reality. And when Martin Scorsese did this with the gangster movies, he was showing the gangster characters as watching gangsters, and therefore like kind of he was making a larger point about machismo and stuff like that, and how it's a created concept. But now it's like gotten so far removed from that, like that basically the generation raised by television, now generation raised by the internet. Similarly, characters have, I feel like, been removed from reality. And I'm saying all of this to make the final point, which is what I think is the kind of like punchline type of thing, which is that every movie is a B movie now,
Hmm.
because like there's no depiction of reality. Every film is basically depicting characters as archetypes and concepts.
Mm.
And therefore like I'm only interested in reading films as like depicting themselves, like as a reflection of the industry as opposed to as a reflection of reality. And therefore like I feel like Hollywood has something useful to offer to me, because it's like almost like like watching the stock market.
Hmm.
It's like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, it's nice. It's like this is the stock that's doing well. That means the industry is like it's finger in the wind. Like this is where the currents are going, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you
I
this
I
one off?
mean I hear you. I think my response to it is that's fine because going to see movies for some people is something that people just need to do. They need to go to the theater, and that's what's available, right? But we have to also then acknowledge that the audience member changes in that way. They become more of a media studies individual. It becomes more of a media studies project because you're now going to the movies to pick apart the semiotics, to kind of excavate the secrets that the person does not realize that they're putting on screen, right? Which is fine, which is what media studies, well, good ones should be doing, right? Um, and but we also then have to acknowledge then what is lost about a film, say like Seconds by John Frankenheimer, which is to me one of the great films analyzing the issues with Western society, right? And the development of the individual in Western capitalism, right? And what that does will always be more transcendent because it will do what American Beauty wants to do. You'll get all the things that your media studies stuff will um, do with American Beauty, but you'll also will get an experience that is asking some deeper existential questions about yourself as well. It'll then go back to you. You know, American Beauty, I will make one comment about it. Horrible movie. I can't stand it. But I do think the backlash has more to do with people not wanting to acknowledge that they all loved it for 5 years. So like it's almost
Absolutely.
like it's an overperformed. Oh my god, it sucked. And I'm like, you all loved it. Like I know I'm comfortable with saying I hated it from the get-go. I thought it was a bad movie. But I also agree with you. Is it worse than a lot of other crap that's been made? Not at all. It's in the same league. Crash too. I remember the backlash of Crash. I found the backlash of Crash interesting because I saw it. I didn't like it, but I wasn't particularly angry about it.
Hmm.
I was like, this is just bad. But I think a lot of that has to do with still this angelic love of the Oscars. It's still hegemonic. There's still this way that where people feel like we have to clean up the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards have to become a legitimate place one day. And there's still this idea that exists amongst people who even consider themselves the most progressive. And I think it's absolute hogwash, and it shows still how trapped people are into what filmmaking should be. But I agree with you. Every American film is a B movie. We live in this era where movies now are referencing bad references
Hmm.
that probably also reference bad references. So because media is proliferated and we see media presentation as reality, it is it's a physical reality, which is what they get wrong. Yes, me watching a movie is a physical actual reality, right? It actually happens, but they look at it as what they see on screen as a reality, right? And then they want to reinterpret that reality, but they never acknowledge that Donna Reed is a character. Archie Bunker is a character. So what does that happen when you take the character and then you rework it? And that was essentially the problem with Annette Bening's character. Sam Mendes couldn't wrap his head around that. What Annette Bening's character was trying to be was a representation of something that wasn't real, that came from an image.
Hmm.
And that's why the movie just falls apart. He just doesn't get that. He's just not deep enough to consider that, right? You know, there's other films that do stuff like that. But I agree with you. They're American films live in a constant self-reference now. That's all it is. They live in a bubble. It's like annoying film Twitter kids, right? Who sit on Twitter all day and all they can talk about is everything through the movie that they liked, right? Everything kind of becomes that, and they have no other references in life. So the movies we get are like that, and
Like they don't have a life outside of that. You're trying to say, right? Like
yeah,
essentially,
yeah,
and
yeah. Yeah,
Like
yeah.
if your whole life is like watching movies, I mean, like on the one hand, we are acknowledging that it's important for whether it's a new critic or a new audience that's emerging to actually watch and
Oh, you have to watch
a
tons of
lot of
movies,
movies.
100%.
But
Yeah.
that said, like that can't be your only reality. That you got to have as touch grass as they say, like you have a life outside of that. And I think, I mean, I don't want to just like, in not just to play devil's advocate, but actually to identify with, I mean, like part of what you're saying is also hitting me because I'm like, damn, what am I doing in this case where like, am I also like sitting around and, saying stuff about movies because I can, instead of living my own life. And I feel like the thing that I fall back on is what is wrong with that
With
as a
watching.
form of patronage of
Oh,
movies where it kind of becomes like, and again, like this is where I feel like, as you said, your friend who said what is wrong with appreciating black exploitation, it's just the movies, and we're falling back on, and this is like, I feel like ultimately to the extent that I thought like Roger Ebert was better off than a lot of people in this, like he really seemed to have a conscience and some sort of a morality or a moral compass that humanism, so to say. But a lot of film critics like tend to posture in a more sort of progressive politics, but at the end of the day, they'll excuse a lot of things in movies because it's just the movies. Uh, yeah.
so
So
here's
how do you square it's like it's still like a form of patronage. It's still keeping movies alive.
yeah.
It's still keeping the culture alive, etc.
So here's how I look at it. And this you talking to someone who watches movies also consistently a lot. I've had a child recently, so I'm watching a little bit less, but I watch them exhaustively. Movies should make you more interested about the world. And that's why you then end up watching a whole lot more movies. That's how I look at it. I think one of the initial things, just like anything, movies can then make you interested in more movies. That's cool. That's good. But I think as you mature as a viewer, you have to remember that movies are made in the world and about the world, right? So I had a student. It was his first year. Um, Talented, very young. He finishes his first year. His film is fine. He asks me, "What should I do? I want to like become better as a filmmaker. Should I like work on my cinematography this summer? Should I do this and should do that?" And I asked him, "What do you do besides making films?" And he looked at me like he didn't have an answer. I said, "What are you interested in?" He says, "Well, I've always been interested in the medieval period. I made a movie about it. Remember?" And I was like, "Yeah." I said, "Read a couple books in the medieval period. Go to medieval times. Do something." And he did that. But the other thing that he later told me was he thought about that question and he said, "Oh, snap. I also did ballet for years." And he had forgot about it. And he got into it. He was reading about it and he made his last film about ballet. I remember. And it was great. He made a mockumentary. He did another class with me where we talked about um, improvisational films. And he began to realize that he couldn't draw more movies just from movies. He had to go into the world. And this is the same thing I think with audiences. Watch a film and then become if it really hits you, learn about the other things that thing was representing because it can you find out interesting things, when you find out why Coppola put the Cuba stuff in Godfather 2. It gets very interesting. I use movies to help me go, further into things. I was like, well, what is this about? What is this about the society? Maybe I should go to this place. I want to know more. It's a window. And that to me is important. And I think about all art. It should catapult us into the world, right? And then we say, wow, movies are this great thing to help me catapult to the outside to the outside world. Let me go watch some more movies and find another place I need to catapult myself to. right? And that's kind of how I operate with it, right? Because I do think there ends up becoming a thing where you limit the power of films if you contain it just to itself. And then the film world will eventually become insular, only self-referential. And I think it actually will lose its really transformative possibility, you
Right.
know. And I think that about with all art, to be honest with you.
I mean, like, and that's why I feel like at the end of the day, I do come from a paradigm in, Ch Chennai, Tamil Nadu, where essentially the movie industry rules. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's huge, it's like it's very popular. It has like the fan clubs are insane. Like every time the movies, a big stars movie, 'cause the stars rule basically. The stars run the industries. So it's essentially like every time there's a new movie that comes out, people will treat it almost as if it's like the deity is coming to town, and like literally, I mean,
Yeah,
they
that's
actually do
great.
the rituals and stuff like that. It almost
Really?
gets, yeah, it gets crazy. They actually kind of enable it a little bit, and I am a little like on the side where I'm like, man, you gotta tone it down a little bit because you're almost being superstitious about this. So when a movie comes out, like it gets really, really crazy over there, and that's why I feel like it has a transformative potential because the industry over there does use these kind of popular films in a Spartacus type way
Mm.
to deliver like really subversive messages, and that's why when I see movies here, the kind of fanfare and adulation that goes into a figure like Tom Cruise, for example, or like even Denzel. Denzel is now like emerging as a sort of Hollywood mascot, as like our greatest living actor, etc. And when I watch a movie like Equalizer, I'm like, yeah, you can sneak in a lot of like, I mean, he sits and reads Invisible Man in one of the scenes in the Equalizer, and I'm like, yeah, okay, if that's like a nice little reference, but
Mm.
that's not what the movie is doing necessarily. It's not really telling the message that Invisible Man, is conveying. But that said, I am an optimist as far as, like mass movies or mass media is concerned because I feel like you can make a hit movie like when something takes off, it takes off. And on that note, I do want to, like basically point out that I recently read the Asata autobiography,
Mm-hmm.
and it has the makings like the whole time I listened to it as an audiobook, and I listened to it on like two
Mm-hmm.
flights, like
Mm-hmm.
one way and the other, and like
Mm-hmm.
the whole time I was just thinking about how that works so well as an action thriller
Yeah.
in like an insane sort of way. And you could have a, I don't know, I mean, like they'd probably butcher it if you had anybody like this as the lead, but I can
Yeah.
also like trade off by having Asata story out. But like if you had Zendaya playing Asata or something like that,
Oh
it could
man.
be an insane action thriller and it would make $1 billion, I feel like. But the fact that nobody has made the movie tells me that it's not really that they care about getting hits, but they want to maintain the narrative. Because that movie, I feel like Asata autobiography,
Yeah.
would be a sure shot hit.
I
The
mean,
fact that,
yeah, I agree. So because here's the thing. The other thing, if you read the book and you have, is there's clearly things that are left out. And that honestly is the real stuff. The things that are left out, like her escape,
right,
which like I've heard details of, and you want to talk about action movie. You want to talk about action movie, and even the expropriation she was part of as a BLA member. I mean, her BL in the book, the BLA stuff is very, very underwritten, and part of it is just legal. They had
strategic, yeah.
they had to, but to that point, there is a thing with Asada's narrative because I know someone was trying to make a movie about an independent film maybe about 20 years ago, and I know they didn't get very far with it. And that's just because look, it's cops and it's dead cops. Look, a Fred Hampton movie, and I say this only I don't Fred Hampton is a hero of mine. But a Fred Hampton movie will be made because he was murdered. He's dead. They didn't kill any cops. Right? The cops killed them. right? The flip side with Asada is, there is this thing of murder of police and of people like that, the expropriations, and also she's still at large, right? In Cuba, of all places, right? Which is another element. So you have to acknowledge things that they don't. Like I even say about like Soderbergh's Che film, I think it was able to be made to a certain degree because of the second part is very well, Che died in the end. He didn't see the revolution. Oh well. There is no dialogical kind of connection to the global movement past that, right? It always bothered me. I thought the first part was better than the second part. The second part really actually quite made me angry
Hmm.
about it. I was really, really not into it. I have issues with Soderbergh in general, but like that, I remember the first part was interesting. I was like, this is an interesting film, and I was actually curious. And then when they went to his final, and also they skip all his Africa stuff, which I was like, okay, yeah, got you. Interesting. Um, but yeah, I'm with you. And this would be like a longer conversation, but the mass media's needs consistently change. And there have been times in history where things have been able to slip through, you know. I think of, and then and filmmakers have had to be very smart. I think of films like Duck You Sucker by, oh gosh, Sergio Leone, which is like the only, I mean, I'm not a Leone fan, but that film I think is great. Duck You Sucker, which is his most political film that he did. But part of the reason why he was able to kind of dive into the political waters a bit with that film is because of, the kind of way that spaghetti westerns are like not real world, right? Now that is the Brechtian way of
Right.
subverting reality, right? You're doing Brecht here, and that's real, and that's political, and it's very smart. But there's a way that I think mass media is just like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. Like that can't happen anymore. We play with fire for various reasons. Let's give people what they want, what they needed. But right now, absolutely not. This is not happening. You
Yeah,
know.
so it's kind of fascinating that like Brechtian, the one of the most Brechtian aspects is like a musical because song and dance numbers are
Yes,
huge in Brecht.
100%.
And like the fact that musicals are kind of wicked is doing this. And there was like, and I think like Adam McKay had this tweet recently. You're not on Twitter, but like this was like a slightly controversial, like it made the rounds where he was like calling Wicked as like one of the most left-wing movies.
I didn't hear
Part
about this.
in recent times and stuff, and it's like, you can make the case. I haven't seen the movie, but like I would imagine, like they've probably done some stuff in this. I can imagine the extent to, again, like the American movies have a hard ceiling type of thing. I can imagine how far it went, but it's not going to be the Matrix, even like it's not going to be even something like Speed Racer, for example,
No.
which the Wachowskis made. So it's like, but at the same time, if you have a tendency among the public to consume, for the lack of a better word, song and dance numbers where they're occasionally titillated by these kind of like little bursts of song, then you can, maybe even make Asada as a some musical,
But I think
where
that
she
would be great. No,
where
I
she
I,
instead of killing the cops, like she just like beats them up or something by with a dance number or like does breakdancing and stuff
I
like that. I don't
believe
know.
it. I 100% believe in that. I'm serious. I don't say this sarcastically or trying to be ironic. No, I totally do believe in that. Because what the Brechtian thing is all about distance, right? You're able to distance from it, right? And then you can consider the implications of what we're supposed to see here, so that the audience really becomes an interlocutor or has the opportunity to become one, right? And I truly do believe in that. And you've seen it in works and films, especially in a lot of plays. You've seen that, and that's where theater has been really instructive. And they don't allow film to do that in America because I do think it's just too foreign for them. But
Hmm.
then also, I think for people who are sophisticated, right? A sophisticated kind of, I don't know, studio head greenlighter also knows that that kind of subversion could cause ruckus, and they're not about that.